Thanks, Grace. Hey, everybody, if you can take your seats and we'll get started very soon. Oh, it's so quiet in the room. Everybody's excited. All right. Well, I am just beyond thrilled to get to introduce our keynote. Scott Dadich is not only an incredible person from what you know, but we had the pleasure of having dinner with him last night, and he's just a really great individual, too. So Scott is an award-winning storyteller and that spans many genres. So from the written word to film, as you know, and to design. He is the creator of the series you all have watched, Abstract: The Art of Design. And so it was really cool. I got to pick his brain a little bit on this yesterday, and I know you all are going to have amazing questions for him today. He's also the former editor-in-chief of Wired magazine. And at Wired, he had the pleasure of interviewing some pretty incredible people. One, Obama, which was great to hear about, and Edward Snowden. So we heard some awesome stories last night that hopefully you'll get to hear a little bit about today, too. And in addition to all of that I've mentioned, Scott is also the co-CEO of his own firm, a strategy and design firm, Godfrey Dadich Strategy. So I am just so pleased, Scott, to introduce you and have you with us today. It was really cool to have you go around the room and see some ideas and see some of the talented people here. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Erin. Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting me. I think some of you know I'm a Texan, so it's great to be back home. Spent many years in Austin, but originally from Lubbock. And when people ask me what I do, I often sort of have a stutter step there and have a minute to ponder and think about all the things I've been so fortunate to do, from editing Wired to creating Abstract, and with roots in design. And I think I keep going back to that idea about design and thinking really a lot about that, and it's sort of informed a lot of the career decisions that I've made, whether that is in print or digital or strategy or in filmmaking. And so my basic answer is that I'm a designer. And the weird part about this is I didn't quite know that you could be a designer and people would pay you money to make design and to create design decisions until I was about 19 years old. I thought that I wanted to go and create cars and design cars. I was obsessed with building models and Lego growing up, and I had a high school guidance counselor who steered me wrong. I was good at math, but I didn't necessarily like it, and so I got steered into mechanical engineering here at UT. And quickly found out doing calculus 3 problems at 2 in the morning was really not my speed. So I moved back to Lubbock and to Texas Tech, where I sort of kicked around and got a job at a bagel shop. And sort of a lost kid and kind of figuring things out, but the bagel shop was owned by a couple named Phil and Marion Hoot, husband and wife team, amazing people. And so it was the first bagel shop in Lubbock, Texas, Hoot's Bagels. And I was lucky enough to get the early morning shift, so I would get in at 3:30 in the morning and work to noon, and then I could go to class in the afternoon and sort of figure things out. And I remember one day, Marion had let me know, she said, well, when you get in the next morning to start baking, there's gonna be a sign painter, and we're getting these big menu boards put up above the counter, and we had just sort of opened a couple months earlier. And I said, well, sign paint, I'm good at letters and lettering, and I'll do that, and whatever you're gonna pay the sign painter, just pay me half, and I'll just stay up all night and do it. Like every $100 really counted to me. And it was something I just raised my hand for. And so Marion said, sure, okay, I'll take you up on that. So I stayed up all night and hand lettered these atrocious chalk menu boards that we've all seen many, many times, but I was awfully proud of them, and Phil and Marion were as well. So the next morning when we opened, an art director named Sonia Aguirre came in. And Sonia was a regular. She came in every single morning and had the same order. And she said, oh, Marion, you got new menu boards, and who did those? And Marion pointed at me in the back, and they're making bagels. And so Sonia came back, and she gave me her card, And she said, I'm a designer and an art director, and you know letters, and I started my career as a sign painter, and you ought to come in and get an internship from me. And so I was like, that's pretty cool. I'm not quite sure what that job is. So I asked my buddies at the bagel shop. He said, dude, it's so awesome. You know, like cereal boxes? You get to design cereal boxes. It's like, I like cereal. Cereal's pretty good. So I went in and saw Sonia, and she gave me an internship. And my first job as a designer was setting 3-line classified ads in the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. And so we'd create the little paste-ups, and man, I would track and kern every single letter. They were the best-looking classified ads ever. It was really the first time that I fell in love with type. And it was really there that I understood that design could be a career and something that I could chase down. So I finished at Texas Tech in design communications, and very shortly after that was able to be mentored by a friend of mine, now friend of mine, a guy named DJ Stout, who's a Pentagram partner here in town. And DJ was the legendary art director of Texas Monthly, and also a Tech alum, and that connection was made really early on in my design education. I really started to fall in love with how words and pictures came together in the format of a magazine. In 2006, I took that and moved out to San Francisco, where I live today, and I went to Wired magazine, and I became the creative director. And I'll talk a little bit about how that has informed my design education and thinking about the stories that we tell in those journalistic formats. While I was at Wired, I invented a thing that eventually became the Wired iPad app and the digital magazine reading experience that I took to New York and spent 2 years leading Condé Nast's digital enterprises, and was fortunate enough to work with David Remnick at The New Yorker and Anna Wintour at Vogue, and we launched all of the digital platforms for Condé Nast that exist today. In 2012, when we had done all of those launches and sort of worked our way through the whole company, my bosses at the company asked me to move back out to San Francisco and take over Wired as editor-in-chief. And it was a really wonderful challenge with some of my greatest friends in journalism and design to really bring together the platforms of Wired.com for the first time back under ownership at Condé Nast with the print magazine that had been founded 20 years earlier. And from there, thinking about how we told stories, and it was about launching the live event platform and the digital platform and social tools and a video network. And it was during that time that I came up with the notion for abstract, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. And just last year in 2017, after 11 years with the company, I chartered out on my own with my dear friend Patrick Godfrey, and we launched our own firm called Godfrey Dadich. So the moral of all this is I've been so fortunate to have been taught and mentored by so many incredible people. I think most of you might have some idea about Texas Monthly here, but what an incredible platform, and one of the places where I learned how to be a journalist and how to report and write. The people that would come through the halls and we'd put on the cover of the magazine all the way through getting to work with President Obama and interview Edward Snowden in Moscow. The ideas and opportunities afforded by magazine journalism were just some of the most special out there. And it was really the sort of focus that we wanted to take forward in starting our own firm, that we could create the opportunities to tell stories around design and around the way that the world is changing in new formats for our clients and partners. So Patrick and I started working together early on in my tenure at Wired. We became friends and sort of socially hanging out in San Francisco, and it was pretty quick that I latched on to, he has a massive brain and is a brilliant, brilliant guy and brilliant strategist. And in thinking about the challenges ahead of us for Wired, he was really instrumental in helping us shape the editorial strategy that we would drive forward in expanding the vision and scope of what Wired has become today. And it was during that same time that I had started working with President Obama and thinking about the guest edited issue that would actually be one of my last at Wired. We actually met one of his team members here in Austin at South by Southwest, and over a couple of margaritas had talked about what it would be like to work together and how the president could contribute to Wired, because it turns out he was a big fan and longtime reader of the magazine. And so maybe 2 or 3 margaritas in, I said, well, the president ought to just guest edit the magazine. And luckily, my friends in the White House thought that was a cool idea. So over the course of a few months, we got to talk more and more about that, and ultimately culminating in the president actually guest editing this issue. So those ideas really were important to me. And it was about the president's vision for a better tomorrow and about participating in democracy, participating in change, and looking forward into frontiers. And I just clicked too much. And thinking about frontiers, what's around the corner? And that's really that editorial mission and that strategy of Wired, where we were moving away from the notion of technology as the central focus of it, but what about tomorrow? What about the future? How are we organizing ourselves to create meaningful change in the world? And that actually became the theme of his issue, which I'll let him explain here.
Hi, this is Barack Obama, and I am the guest editor of the November issue of Wired. We're going to explore what we call frontiers. The theme is those amazing opportunities and challenges that are going to be arising as a consequence of new technology and new ways of thinking. Everything from landing men and women on Mars to precision medicine and figuring out how the human genome can unlock some of the world's deadliest diseases. It's also going to focus on how we work together to make this happen. And that's going to require leaders, not just like me, but also like you. So I hope you enjoy the issue. Look forward to getting your feedback. I think it looks terrific, and the only thing I noticed is I think you misspelled my name. No, I'm teasing.
He's so funny. That was an amazing moment. I still sort of get chills about that. Boy, we miss him, right? So we had sort of a rude surprise, I guess it was November 9th, didn't we? And the president had started talking about the role of what was going to become the Obama Presidential Center on the south side of Chicago. And typically we think about presidential libraries, we've got one just right around the corner here, as sort of a museum to the years in office and to the terms in office. And what the president wanted to do was really focus on creating a campus for leadership and solving real and meaningful problems by empowering young people all around the world and then bringing them together at the campus, at the Presidential Center. And the goal of the foundation is really to empower that vision. So we started talking about what it could look like to help launch this vision on his first day as a private citizen. And this was really sort of the glue that pulled me and Patrick together to think this is the time for us to launch our firm and think about how design can make a really meaningful difference in people's lives. So what we did was create a 1-minute film that the president could tweet, and he actually did tweet this on his way from Andrews Air Force Base, from the White House to Andrews Air Force Base before he got on Air Force One as his first flight, last flight as president and first as a private citizen. So I'll just share that with you just for a minute. Oop, maybe.
And with that, I just have 2 more words to say. Obama out. This generation coming up, I've seen you in every corner of the country. You are willing to carry this hard work of democracy forward.
So that was a pretty cool way for us to launch the vision for our firm, and something we were so proud to support the president and the foundation, something we're honored to continue to do. And it was in concert with that and thinking about the profiles that we had put together around abstract, and what I really want to talk to you guys today about are some of the lessons that we've learned through this process, through these amazing designers. But first, with a little bit of context about thinking about why design stories matter, how we relate to them as designers and non-designers, and how they really shape the world around us. And this was sort of a concept that became critical to us as we were expanding that vision of Wired when I started to take over as editor-in-chief. And we created a framework that we called Wired by Design, or WXD. And what we wanted to do was create a safe space for designers, creative people to come together, much in a room like this. We actually did it up at Skywalker Ranch, up at George Lucas's place, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. And we invited about 300 of the world's best creatives, designers, filmmakers, chefs, to get together and talk about how they make, how they create, how they challenge one another, how they think about their craft and changing the world in their own very specific ways. So we had amazing people like Pentagram partner Natasha Jen and architect Bjarke Ingels and Dave Chang, the chef. And over the course of 2 days, they sort of got up on stage and whether 20 minutes or an hour would get up and explain their process and talk in vivid detail about how they felt about it and why it mattered to them and where they failed and what happened when they failed. And it was just this amazing chemistry. And a lot of the people that went to that, I still hear from them and have made so many amazing friends through this process of telling design stories. And that was sort of the framework for us in thinking about what abstract would become. Because a friend of mine was actually in the audience, a guy named Dave O'Connor, and Dave called me a couple weeks after Wired by Design and said, you know what, those stories need to be told to a broader audience. They're important, and I think there's something in there that we could take to Netflix. So a couple weeks later, we had put together a little framework of what we thought the show could be, and in fact, some of the people that were speakers at Wired by Design were actually on our first roster of designers, and ended up that we were creating this show that you guys have all watched. I did want to share the trailer again, because after hours and hours and hours of filming with each of them across 8 different episodes, there were these important narratives that started to emerge that we wanted to put together and to frame out into the 100+ million people in the Netflix audience. And I think some of those are going to be what we're going to continue to explore over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. So let's take a look at the trailer.
What's important is the story, the message, the feeling, the connection. It's design.
You go, oh my God, how am I going to solve this problem?
I really want to affect as many people as possible.
Honestly, nobody wants authenticity.
Tastemaking takes time. So if you get it wrong, you get it really wrong.
It's the best storytelling product we've ever done.
It was widely discussed that I had pushed it too far.
What are you going to make the audience feel? Something true.
It's the kind of shit we do.
I wanted to make something that would excite people about the future.
All I care about is what's happening on the page.
What can I make next? That drive never goes away.
You're looking for a moment when you feel you're as close to the soul as possible. That's what good design is.
I love Bjarke's quote in there. We use that around the office now. We're asking someone a question, well, are we going to proceed with that, or are we going to go with that creative concept? It's the kind of shit we do. It's always a good answer. The cool thing about these films, and what we wanted to do was create an anthology series where 8 independent films could sort of add up to tell a larger narrative. And the way to do that was both to follow along with process and understand how these designers created the things that they make and shape, but also why, and understand where the decision points come together to make the things themselves. So one of the key things for us in making these films was actually to dig down a level below what we think is actually going on. Sure, Christoph is creating a cover for The New Yorker, but really it's a big treatise on abstraction and about reduction and putting time in. So what I did was pull out some of these themes, and I want to share with you how we actually looked at the specific tools and specific storylines that end up influencing the shape of the season, but also the particular design pursuits that these designers pursue. As Devlin, she's really fundamentally in that episode about perspective and scale. Ilse talks about creating a frame for life, and you've never thought really about a room as being a vehicle to transport you through space and time, but we spend so much of our lives actually living and moving in between rooms and spaces. Tinker, on a surface, is a sneaker designer, but for him, it's all about telling stories, and all of his best designs really have to be about the story behind the athlete, and the process of creating is actually more important than the aesthetic values of the thing. Christoph, we talked about stripping away. Bjarke, resolving conflict between polarities and thinking about two different things being simultaneously both yin and yang. Paula, with the arc of her career, thinking about where she sits in her practice, where she thinks about in the improvement of her craft, and then the necessary changes that come into resolving a design over time. There's nothing ever sort of done in Paula's world. She just continues to press forward and forward. And then finally, Platon, thinking about denoting and giving power to groups that maybe don't have power, and using the tools of power to frame it down a broader spectrum of humanity. And so those ended up being the really critical functions. Oh, we got clicked a little too fast. The really critical functions in thinking about how we're going to shape out a holistic season, and think about how we're going to provide the most value and meaning in talking about design to audiences that maybe haven't ever thought about it, that they didn't ever encounter and think about that a designer is making decisions and shaping those outcomes into the stuff of our lives. If we think about it, Dieter Rams really was one of the first designers who helped shape this kind of practice with his 10 principles for good design. But I actually think there's something even more meaningful in talking about design being about the way things work. And the example I like to use is about the Wright brothers. So we have this sort of folk history that the Wright brothers invented powered flight, and they didn't at all. Around this time, there were so many experiments, all sorts of people trying to put motors and wings together in ways that could actually enable a human to fly. And the Wrights were no different. There were dozens of concepts around this. It's sort of like what's going on with the Hyperloop right now. Teams all around the world thinking about the particular challenges of this experience. And really, this is a human experience problem. The Wright brothers didn't invent powered flight. They designed it. They actually made a couple different calculations and pulled a couple different pieces of mechanical pulleys and bicycle equipment to pull, creating a scalable path and a workable system where a human could interact with a machine to create powered flight. And that's really the design process at its heart. It's the way Ferdinand Porsche said, I love this quote, design is not simply art, it is elegance of function. Again, that idea that it's really about how it works. If you're an interface designer and you're thinking about an affordance in an app, does that button need to be red or should it be blue? If you're an architect, what about the decision of substrate? Or is this going to be stainless steel, or are we going to think about spruce, a wood? If you're an engineer, you're thinking about code base. Is it Python or is it Swift? All of these are design questions, and the design process is really filled with these questions. You guys have been asking and answering them all day in this room. And they really frame, the answers to those questions frame out whether you're creating a skyscraper like Bjarke Ingels or a sneaker like Tinker Hatfield. It really gets at that fundamental notion that design isn't how things look, it is how they function. Design makes things work. And that is really the central through line of the series that we try to illuminate through all the processes that we followed and all the scenes that we were able to be lucky enough to film. So if we think about design as decision maker, and I call myself a designer, one of the things that's really interesting about the process of evolving design and thinking about why do these 8 people matter in such an important way, and why do the things that they create stand out from the rest of design products in the world? Because we're inundated all day, every day. Everything we interact with has been designed by someone. And so often we're taught to follow the right path. There are rules, there are things you should do, and there are things you shouldn't do. And I am the most rules-oriented person. I am so anal retentive. I organize my books by color. So when I got into design class and my professors were going up and, well, the type should be this large and the grid should be like this and this is how Swiss design works, and I loved it. It was like, the world started to make sense to me, and I had all these very clear boundaries of what I was and was not supposed to do. And then there was this other side of it where something didn't quite feel right, and it fell into a territory where it was against what my professor had told me, or just I had some gut intuition that it wasn't quite right, there was this weird sense of unease. And in particular, I discovered that through the application of a little orange bar, and I'll share that story with you. When I was starting at Wired in 2006 as creative director, the then editor-in-chief was a guy named Chris Anderson, and we talked about the origins of Wired, and those of you who remember the early days of it, it was bright neon colors and oversized, and it was silver ink on neon orange. It was incredibly hard to read, and it was really thrilling. As an exercise in magazine journalism and design, it was unlike any other magazine that we had ever seen. In a lot of ways, it was sort of like the Blueberry iMac. We'd never seen a computer that looked like this. And so in thinking about where I wanted to evolve the design language of Wired and talking to Chris, the new Sunflower iMac had just come out. And it sort of provided the context and framework for me to think about, well, what if it's not so much about the package, but it's more about what's on the screen, especially as we move into the digital means that we all enjoy today. And obviously this is before the iPhone, but even thinking about how the screen matters a little bit more than the substrate itself. And so in digging into the design process and thinking about the questions that I wanted to ask, I stripped it down to the studs, basically. What is the fundamental building block of the Wired design language? Turns out it was a pixel. And John Plunkett, the founding designer of Wired, had developed a really beautiful system where that idea of on and off, a 1 and a 0, binary code, actually being the synthesis of the design language. And it was that representation that we see in the Wired logo, that idea of 1s and 0s alternating in that sort of vibrating pattern. And that's actually the framework that informs the spine, maybe one of the most famous pieces of the Wired branding schemes. So when you look at that whole shelf full of spines, you can now know where that comes from. So Chris gave me a lot of liberty. He said, there are two things you can't change. You can't change the spine, and you can't change the logo. But everything else is fair game. And so in thinking about that, I went back to my training and the places where I felt really good about the rules and order and obligations to the craft, and thinking about how I could pursue this path of creating the new Sunflower iMac version of Wired. So I really dug into this and created some beautiful typefaces with Jonathan Heffler and Tobias Fair-Jones at Heffler. And Fair-Jones, we actually built the typeface Vitesse. We actually engineered into every slab serif a perfect pixel onto every single letter form of every single weight. We engineered the grid systems and mapped that square into every dictate and where and why and how information was going to come together with a headline or a photograph. And I took this to the nth degree, thinking about the grid systems and the flow of the book. And after about 8 or 9 months, I had the first issue of the newly redesigned Wired. And to me, it fit every rule. It was perfect. Everything lined up just so. And this was the cover. So Dan Winters had gone and photographed the great John Hodgman. And I was really obsessed with Mad Men at the time. And it just started, and that sort of jet set vibe and really sleek. And you remember the history of Wired with all these bright colors. I wanted to do something that had no color in it. And I was really proud of how everything just lined up with his jacket and the typography and all of our fancy new typefaces. And so I marched down the hallway to Chris's office and I said, Chris, I've got a great thing for us. Here's the new cover of the redesigned Wired. And he looks at it, and he looks at it. I'm standing there. He's like, it's a little boring. I'm like crushed, totally crushed. But it follows all the rules, and look at the type just lines up with his jacket. And he goes, and the designers in the room will know this one. Can't you just add some more colors? I was pissed. I was so mad. And so I snatched it off his desk, and I'm fine, I'll get you some colors. And I'm walking back to my office past every cover of Wired along the way, and you see these neon colors everywhere, and I hated this neon orange. I'm looking at my Pantone book, like, oh, I'll give him some color. The ugliest, shittiest color I know, Pantone 811. Open up my InDesign, and I get the file out, and all I can muster, like I'm physically ill now after all this time, all I can do is draw this little orange rectangle coming off of that so important spine. And I was just couldn't stand it. So I just marched back down and like here, Chris, here's your color. And he said, oh, okay, great, let's print it. And he just totally called my bluff because he knew how angry it made me and how upset I was to break out of my rules. And he knew something about me and about this design that I didn't quite get at the time, that little square of orange just activated something about what was right in the cover, that little disruption. It caused people to ask why, especially all of the other editors. They said, why is there an orange bar on our cover, Scott? Like, talk to Chris. But it was a decision. It was something active, and it was something that made me feel weird and uncomfortable about the work that I was doing as a designer. And the weird thing was that I kind of liked it. I got it back from the printer a couple weeks later, and then it sat there on my desk, and I was like, there's something kind of neat about that weird little orange bar, but sure, let's try it again. So I opened a layout, and I was working on 2 different type solves for this opener about Ridley Scott, an oral history of Blade Runner. And I had 2 that I was working on, and I sort of overlapped the 2 and then closed one window and combined these 2 layouts into one. And it looks like a mistake. And so I went and called Chris's bluff again. And like, this is how we're printing this. Look at this. And it came out really cool. It was one of those things where there was something interesting about the design dialogue. I'm not pretending that any of these layouts are earth-shattering, but what it unlocked for us was, on the team, a process whereby we could actually find something that we thought was pleasing or follow the rules and then go tweak one thing. Whether it was in a layout or a piece of typography, just one little decision that would skew the viewer's perspective and activate the storytelling instinct of what my first mentor called variations on a rectangle. We have this space, and we think about arranging images and words to guide a user through the journey of a magazine. And over the course of time, it actually turned into sort of a design grammar for us. And me and the design team, we would pass layouts back and forth. And when someone was too shy to go and ruin their own design, I'd pass it over to the designer sitting next to them and say, Christy, I'm sorry you can't ruin your design, but Carl sure can. So back and forth it went. And it sort of became this little ethos, and it was something that helped us govern how Wired looks. So fast forward a couple of years, and to this cover, where I love this idea that we're going to take the most handsome man on the planet and put the shittiest, ugliest piece of technology in his ear. So wrong theory number 1, right out of the gate there. But you can see the evolution of the little orange bar. We're now interplaying with the logo and using type architecturally to sort of interlock in almost a Tetris fashion fit in there. And that together really summed up how we started to think about design language and how I thought about my creative process as someone who was trying to advance the field of graphic design. And in this case, very simply, the cover design of Wired, thinking about something that I like to call the sort of movie poster for a magazine. Used to be, the magazine cover was really about the newsstand and going down to book people and understanding what was at the newsstand or at the airport. And now we encounter covers really on Instagram first or on Facebook. And so how do you arrest the viewer? How do you stop someone in their tracks and really get that movie poster moment? And that was really due to wrong theory and how we thought about achieving the storytelling means through these kinds of design languages. And it was something as editor-in-chief that I really tried to push through into our digital streams. That rules tell us that browser-led stories and stories on the website had to be a certain way. And what we tried to do was push more of the graphic qualities of it and more of the immersive tangents that allowed us to have Wired-like storytelling no matter what device that we were thinking about. Sort of coming full circle for me and thinking back to the notions of the very first redesign exercise that I had discussed with Chris. And in fact, it was something that we really tried to push into the storytelling and the practice of building the Wired iPad app. And it was why I felt so fortunate that this was the first of its breed and that Steve held it up at the 2010 Developers Conference. And it wasn't long after that I moved to New York and started to work on the New Yorker iPad edition. And this was the first time that I started to move wrong theory into film storytelling. And we had built this app and we sort of knew how it worked, but remember, these were sort of new. We didn't have a lot of iPads in circulation, and people were starting to learn how to consume content and read magazines in these new kinds of apps. And so David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, said, why don't we create like a little tutorial, a little user guide on how to use this app? Because New Yorker readers a little older, and then maybe just getting their iPad. Let's just help them out a little bit. So I called Jason Schwartzman and Roman Coppola, And we started to think about, well, what if you could do that, but there'd be something wrong in every scene? And this was the result.
Hi, I'm Jason Schwartzman, and I'd like to show you the New Yorker app for the iPad. So here it is, and you get every story every Monday, and when you find something that you're interested in, you just tap it, and to read it, you just swipe it vertically. There's a couple ways to get around the app. Touch anywhere on the screen, brings up your set of controls. Hit this one, table of contents, and then, excuse me. Hello? The hospital? All right, what's the number? 32365. All right, don't pull it till I get there. All right, bye. So here's the table of contents. Give it a firm swipe. You find something you want to read, and bingo was his name-o. Swipe horizontally to flip from story to story, or hit the browse button for a zoomed-out view of the entire issue. The fastest way to get from story to story is by using the scrubber located here at the bottom of the screen. Look. Incredibly, you can touch any cartoon in the magazine and be magically swept away to the cartoon gallery where all of the cartoons in the issue are. Yes, all of the cartoons are. Don't forget to go to the cartoon caption contest. You can enter it straight from the app. Also included in the app are audio, video, and slideshow settings. For instance, if you wanted to listen to an author reading from their story, simply tap this red icon located here. Also, all these features work in both orientations. That's it. I hope this has been helpful. And please keep in mind that the New Yorker is constantly updating and improving their app. Thank you very much and have a great day.
So that was fun. We racked up, I think, 5 million views in the first week. So a little wrong theory went a long way. And so by the time I came back to Wired, I really wanted to commit all this to paper. And I had really started to think much more as a designer about the process and the evolution and these steps that lead us to finding discomfort in design. And as I started to research, I found I thought I had sort of invented this. Like, goes long before me. I have nothing to do with inventing this. I just sort of put a name on it. And one of the key areas where I thought there was something to this, I started to look back at Impressionist painting. And there was a technological development in 1841 by a guy named John G. Rand. He invented the tin paint tube. And before this, there was no way to take pigment and oil paint out into the world and capture a fleeting moment. But because of the tin paint tube and because of the new chemical evolutions to bring the phthalo blue and the brilliant reds and crimsons, and it actually afforded the rise of Impressionism because artists like Monet and Renoir were actually able to take these paints out into the world and capture really quick scenes and things that felt impressionistic, and hence the rise of Impressionism. And like a lot of things, there's sort of a set of rules that come out of this about composition and framing and brushwork, and that's where that school of thought emerges. So you have a new technological innovation, and you have people flocking to that to try it and obsess and talk about the parameters and rules of the medium, and then suddenly you have someone stepping out of it. And in this case, we're so familiar with the cafe scenes of Renoir and Degas with the dancers, but it was a particular Degas painting that really stopped me in my tracks. Look at this painting. This painting caused a scandal. It's called Jockeys Before the Race. And that pole going through the horse's head here was absolutely unheard of in the Impressionist school. It broke all of these rules. You weren't supposed to have a foreground element obstructing any view of the composition. You have the middle and background, and you're just not supposed to do this. In fact, it was so scandalous, it got mentioned in Punch magazine and ridiculed as a mistaken impression. This is sort of like the Vanity Fair of its time. And the whole French salon and all of the Impressionist school ridiculed Degas because of this one set of decisions. But you know what? You fast forward a little bit, and you see Cartier-Bresson use the technique. You start to understand the use of tension and framing, Robert Frank in the 1950s. Lee Friedlander in 1966 inserted himself in his own photograph, his own shadow, to talk about the documentation of the frame itself and actually the origin of its making. And now, let's be clear, these are exquisite photographs, and they're technically perfect. So there's a consensus about craft, but it's a single decision that's pushing it beyond the norm and into conversation. All the way up in the 1980s, a photographer named Alex Webb would go and shoot obsessively, just rolls and rolls of film, looking for that one moment of tension. And it's really how we see the world today. These look really like resonant and immediate images to us because of that breakdown in the subject and foreground and the relationship between how we perceive and how we view the world. Then I started looking into music, and then it turns out that Igor Stravinsky in 1913 caused a sort of similar panic as Jockeys Before the Race when he debuted The Rite of Spring. And he did it in Paris, an opening night. By the second act, he was layering strings on top of one another and folk melodies with harmonies that didn't quite resonate. To us, that's sort of like a new version, at the time, a new version of remix culture. Parisians did not know what to do with this, and by the end of the second act, people were throwing vegetables onto the stage, and a fight broke out, and 46 people were ejected. A year later, Stravinsky was the toast of Paris with the hottest show in town, because people had acclimated to how that sound could work and how it could challenge their perceptions about composition in that space. This, in turn, led directly to and is one of the key influences of Miles Davis. Quincy Jones came over to Miles Davis's studio one time, and he asked Miles, do you ever try to play the wrong notes? Do you ever try to play the wrong note and then work your way back to the right? And that was one of the key influences for Miles with Bitches Brew, one of the most seminal albums in his career, which, guess what, we can draw a straight line into a band like Radiohead, who credit Miles and that album in particular with authoring and helping them define the sound that they determined on OK Computer, and then very quickly with their very next record with Kid A threw out entirely and pivoted once again to think anew. We see it in architecture, and this was actually the idea that with Renzo Piano and Richard Rodgers, that we're going to take the guts, the fundamental elements of the Centre Pompidou and put them on the outside of the building. Everything else is going to function just like a museum, and it's going to have art and elevators and move people around and a cafe and a bookstore. But guess what? The ventilation, the electric, and the water is going to be on the outside of the building. This pissed people off so much. And it was a direct influence and antecedent to Tinker Hatfield's design for the Air Max. That idea that we could actually see the guts of the thing. And that simple decision to cut that little window in the midsole was something that was so critical for Tinker. So let's try to frame this up a little bit. Wrong theory. A couple different steps. It is not the sort of traditional Silicon Valley cliche of just throwing out the rule book and just starting wherever you feel like it. It's not the idea of just, oh, go think outside the box, try something new. It's not that at all. And it's not this trope that we see a lot, well, just fail fast and then make a mistake and move on to the next thing. The way I see wrong theory is sort of different. It's about following the rules and getting really good at what you do. Sort of the 10,000-hour rule. Putting in the work and the reps to get to be the best in your particular field. Degas was one of the best painters of his era, and that gave him the permission to go and try and challenge things with the composition. So I sort of see it in 3 steps. Often there's a technological innovation. There's a thing like the tin paint tube that allows a new thing to happen. And when you have a new thing, there's a lot of experimentation. People flock to it, and they try things out. And guess what? Consensus starts to emerge. Sally looks at Tom and says, well, yeah, that was pretty cool. And Tom looks at Frank and says, well, that was actually pretty cool. And the rules start to emerge. So out of that experimentation, we get the feeling of consensus. And then, and only then, can we start into moving into that world where we're starting to make the decisions that are wrong, simply because now we have a rule book. But critically, it has to make you feel bad. And I found in my life and my career and in my creative work in design, it's really only when I feel sort of sick to my stomach that I'm actually creating something new in my own design vocabulary. So sure, we can look at paintings and movies and music and find some threads. But what about today? What about technology and where we find ourselves as consumers in this world and folks who help to create that? All of us here in this room thinking about creating new versions of products and interfaces and tools and hardware. Well, it turns out it's here too. Think about personal computing. You have a new product like a PC. Think about how consensus emerged about how you sold the PC. It was all about power, right? I love this ad, the Tandy 5000 there for the low, low price of $69.99 with 84 megs of RAM. Real bargain there. This was the circular you get it at Best Buy. It's just a list after list of tech specs, right? Because they're all the same beige box. The rules said computers have to be a beige box and they have to sit on your desk and here's where the monitor goes. And then Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive come out and say, fuck that. We're gonna make the thing purple and pink and yellow. And guess what? It's actually gonna be more powerful and do more things. And it's gonna give you more control. So not only does it hew to the rules where it's supposed to, it takes an exception to the thing that defines a PC and makes us understand what a personal computer ought to be. They did it again, thinking about the sleek and sexy laptops moving into these beautiful pieces of glass that we all carry around in our bags and pockets. But guess what? The iPhone invented the medium, but consensus emerged. And if you look at all the phones out there today, they're pretty much the same thing. They all sort of weigh about the same. They're all sort of a black glass and maybe some color. But basically, the tool is identical. So you can understand why I got excited when I saw the Pixel 2 with, guess what, a little orange button on it. It was like, oh, look at this. Imagine that. We are starting to see this consensus form across computing about interface design. Look at the typefaces for the top 3 OSs. We have Siri. We have San Francisco for Apple, Roboto and Google, and Segoy for Microsoft and Cortana. They're almost identical. They're almost the exact same typefaces. We have reached this age where we're just all in total agreement about the way those products ought to conform. I was talking to Kevin Systrom about this, and he told me the story that Instagram is actually a wrong theory experiment. The reason that Instagram exists today is because they took an active role in trying to subvert convention. He and Mike Krieger were sitting around, and they were working on this app called Bourbon, B-R-B-N. And it was their sort of a social game where you could check in and maybe tag a photo of where your friends are and sort of search each other out in real life. And Mike went over to the chalkboard and he said, you know, let's just get at the root of the problem here. So this is 2010. There's no Instagram. Think about Facebook as the main way that we're connecting with friends. And you think about your feed and what you did. You had a digital camera probably. Your phone camera wasn't that good at the time. And you'd go to a party on Saturday night, you take a bunch of pictures, and you'd take that and you take the chip and you'd upload it to your computer, and then you'd upload it and share it with your friends. So Mike wrote this sentence on the whiteboard. Today online, people post photos that they take with cameras, they store them in albums to share with their friends. Right? 2010, perfectly accurate. Then Kevin goes over to the board and he says, well, let's just question a few things. Are they always going to be taking them with their cameras? Like, maybe not. Maybe the phone camera is probably going to get good enough that we can just always have a camera with us, and that's going to be our phone. Well, do we have to put those pictures into albums and have to put them onto Facebook? No, I mean, you could just share one picture if you wanted to. And why does it have to be just with your network of friends on Facebook? Because you just open it up and just share it with anyone who wanted to follow you. And they found some agreement there. This is a calculated set of things that you're not supposed to do at the time. And that led directly to Instagram. And that was actually their big unlock. Just a couple little product iterations, and here we are 1 billion users later. It's really colossal. And you think about, there are stories like this all over the digital landscape in product and beyond. And that's really the basis for me of how to look at and how to use wrong theory in your creative practice and in your day-to-day lives. For me, it's sort of those three steps. You know, what is it that makes the design successful? Well, if it's about functionality, it still has to work. It still has to do the thing that it was designed to do. In the case of the iMac, it still has to be a really good computer. It can have a weird colored shell, but it still has to be really performant. Think about where the rules have been dictated. We have accepted theory and practice and things that you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. Where are the sort of zones where you can push the boundaries and think anew about how that works? Oh, this clicker, I'm sorry, guys. The third is the one I think that's really critical, and this notion of personal discomfort. The way that the neon orange activated me, and you know it and you feel it in your gut when something goes really wrong and you're doing something that doesn't make sense in your mind or your gut, in your soul, I think that's when you're onto something where it's new. And that's really where you're starting to activate wrong theory. So use that sort of as a litmus test in your work, and I think you'll find that it's a cyclic process, and it's something that requires sort of comfort and discomfort, and it often requires an external voice to come in and help define those things. This was something that was really critical for us in thinking about the lessons that we could pull out of abstract and why these 8 designers have achieved so much in their lives, because they found the right areas to find their own discomfort, where they haven't been sure about whether this was going to work out or not. Tinker has thought over the course of his 40 years at Nike that he's going to get fired any minute. He's that uncomfortable about it because he knows how to push his own boundaries and the boundaries of the culture itself. So if we go back and we think about those themes, those ideas that underlie all the different episodes, let's actually unpack these. And I brought a couple clips that I just wanted to use to illustrate, because I think there's some lessons that are maybe helpful for us all to take away. And these aren't readily apparent in the episodes. You're not going to really go and take notes on all these when you're watching them on Netflix. But I did want to share them because I think they're really instructive, and they can be fairly universal in thinking about our work together. So Christoph, stripping away. His episode's about abstraction, right? So he has this ability to pull these images together through incredible insight. And one stroke of the brush, if you follow him on Instagram, his paintings are magnificent. And he can have 2 colors and watercolor and describe the most vivid and beautiful scene, or the wit of a New Yorker cover, just by a single stroke work or a single concept just beautifully executed. One of the things that you didn't see in the episode was this tension. So there's a famous piece of his with the toothbrush and the toothpaste sort of making out. You've seen it on a poster and a book cover. And we wanted to sort of follow him around. Like, where did he get this crazy idea of the toothbrush and toothpaste being passionately in love? And Morgan Neville, my co-creator and director of this episode, went to Christoph and he said, well, I just want to follow you around. I want to follow your day-to-day life and understand, like, where do you get these crazy inspirations? And Christoph really objected to that. And so what you do see in the episode is that dialogue between Morgan and Christoph, and that's what we're going to watch right here.
When you show the real thing, you kill it. You actually make it impossible to then look at these things in the abstract. It's like in I think in Charlie Brown, you never see the grown-ups. You only hear just like these muffled voices. And that's perfect. It's amazing. Like the one moment you would zoom out and show these grown-ups, they could be designed perfectly. They could be written perfectly, but everything else would be crashing down. So in a way, I feel like we already zoomed out and showed, even though I don't know if I'm a grown-up, but that's already far too big of a zoom out. And then if we go even further there.
But so much of your daily routine and life inspires your work. It just seems like we should be able to see it.
Well, I guess, yeah. Okay, honestly, nobody wants authenticity. The authenticity is like changing your kid's diapers. It's just like, it's a cute idea in the abstract, but the real deal is just, all I care about is what's happening on the page.
You can see how disgusted he is with Morgan. He really does not want to show him brushing his teeth. But I love that. And the most amazing thing about Christoph's craft is the commitment to coming into the office. You think about that romantic notion about, well, just go be creative and travel the world and it will find you. No, he goes and sits his ass in the chair every single day from 9 to 6, every single day. He must have those constraints and restrictions. He has to have that idea of a border, whether it's designing for an Instagram square or for a New Yorker cover. That constraint is really important for him. But there's a lot of frustration, and there are a lot of ideas that never see the light of day. So making that commitment to the craft and to being there and being present and being active and doing the work, I think is one of the greatest lessons that I pulled out of his episode and working with him. And then really cool, I love this idea of having a careless abandon as an artist and then being a ruthless editor. being able to simultaneously within your own person to be totally carefree and come up with really stupid ideas, and then to be a ruthless editor and come back and say, that's not going to work, that's not going to work, that's not going to, but this, there's something here. And that's a rare skill and something that can be developed, but I think it's really critical to the way that Christophe has created his design. Tinker, we talked a little bit about this with the Centre Pompidou, the idea of showing the design as a feature of design, actually creating a framework whereby the physical form of the artifact, in this case the shoe, really speaks to how it's made, the materiality of it, and the technology inside of it. So in terms of showing the guts, this is really how Tinker has operated across his entire
Nike
career.
was encapsulating gas inside a urethane airbag for a cushioning component. I thought, let's make the bag a little bit wider and make sure it's stable, but then let's go ahead and move part of the midsole so you actually see it.
The closest you'd come to anything before that was, I remember as a kid seeing Elton John having high heel shoes with a goldfish inside of them, right? I mean, it was simply like very punk even.
I had gone to Paris and seen a very controversial and loved or mostly hated building, the Georges Pompidou Center, designed by Renzo Piano. It was a building with all of the inside mechanics on the outside of the building. They painted everything in primary colors just to piss off people even more.
He took the color of the Air Max from that as well. And in fact, his marketing team told him, you can't release that shoe with the ugly cutaway on the side with a red midsole. Red shoes don't sell at all. Guess what? It's the #1 selling shoe in the history of Nike, red and all. But Tinker can weave a great story. I love just listening to him talk about the how and the why and the where, and all of those famous Air Jordan shoes come with story. They come with the personal interactions between him and Michael. The function is actually a virtue to be celebrated. You see this in the McEnroe shoe. You see this in the function of the Agassi shoe. You see this in ACG, the new lines that are out that he's creating now, whether it's in accentuation with color or the use of the form itself to actually provide sort of some guidance and rigor to the actual format that it's going to take on the way forward. And then finally, I think the patience that he exhibited and the whole storyline about the Back to the Future shoe is so amazing that he could get hired by Robert Zemeckis to concept and think about and design a shoe that Michael J. Fox would wear in the future version of Back to the Future 2, and then be patient enough and persistent enough to believe in that design, to see it through actually to become the self-lacing shoe that we know today. And that patience and drive is something I think that we can all learn from in thinking about the commitment to design and the commitment to process around those kinds of creations. Ez is amazing. I hope some of you have gotten to see one of her shows, whether for Beyonce or Kanye. They're just incredible experiences. And one of my biggest regrets about the series is we weren't actually able to really demonstrate what it feels like to be at one of these events. The sonic qualities alone, let alone the lightscape and interaction between the stories that she creates on stage and off of it. And I think she illustrates it really beautifully in this clip here.
I thought that bands, you see, because I had been going out with a record producer and we went to see lots of shows, and I always thought they were visually really desperately boring. Probably because I went to the wrong ones. I didn't go to the fascinating ones. But they always looked like this. People playing guitars here, you might have had keyboards here, and then you sometimes had a curtain or the band's name up here, or if you were really lucky, you might have had some projection. But that was pretty much everything I saw in bands. And I didn't like this shape because I thought it was a hump-backed band shape. And I was used to looking at opera and theatre, and I thought that was a mess. And I didn't like these lights up here that just did roo-rah, rah, 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 lighty things. I didn't like it. So, first time I did a rock show, I said, why don't we put them all in their own little box? You can go in here, Mr. Drummer. You can go in here, Mr. Guitarist. Singer can go in here. I put a gauze on the front, like this, which is a kind of netting. And I put a mirror all over the sides, very cheap crap mirror, because I didn't have much money. And my idea was to sort of deconstruct the anatomy of this four-piece band. So you just saw the vocalist's mouth, the drummer's nose, the guitarist's eye, and the bass player's ear. But in my excitement, I neglected to remember that this was their farewell gig, and they would need to take a bow and step out and be seen by their adoring fans. So I just stapled this front gauze on, and also, once they're in, I stapled the rear projection screen on, so they actually couldn't get out.
A slight mistake there. This was actually the show that Kanye got recommended to her, and that idea of transforming function, that one decision that the band doesn't have to be in that humpback band shape, but they could exist in a much more graphic framework, really proved critical to her career, just that single decision. And constructing the frame before you break it, I think really germane to the wrong theory conversation about building in craft and building something exquisite and functional and excellent before you go and find a new perspective on it. And then the same kind of idea of undermining reality through that shift in scale, shift in perspective. You saw it a lot with the work in U2 especially. With Bjarke, I think this is one of the more interesting challenges. And we're so often of the idea, and we get told, well, you have to pick. It can't be great and cheap. And the idea that both things can resolve in different kinds of ways, and the restrictions of a client or of a project brief or a budget can be reconciled in some really unique ways. And Bjarke really came to fame by doing this and working with developers in Copenhagen early on in his career, where the realities of a project deadline and the budget that they were established, or the zoning law around a place, or the physical footprint of a building plan had to be reconciled with his really outsized ambition to create things in new kinds of frameworks in ways that people hadn't seen before. And I think one of the best examples of that is the case study of The Mountain, this apartment building just outside of Copenhagen.
The master plan of this whole neighborhood was basically saying to build like a stack of apartments and then like a big box of parking behind. So we got this idea of saying, like, what if the parking fills the entire site, and then instead of having a vertical stack of homes, they become houses with gardens, like a giant staircase covering a big sort of mountain of parking.
This is the idea of pragmatic utopianism, the idea that something can be functional and really pleasurable. In this case, everyone in that apartment building got a great view. They got a deck in a way that they never would have had before, just by combining the two forms and putting the parking structure underneath the apartments themselves. And that just really goes to the heart of the work that he does and why developers hire him, and I think why we're seeing some of the most exciting designs in all of architecture emerge from his studio, from the big studio, that you don't have to choose, and that minimalism is sort of a cop-out. The idea that you can actually have your cake and eat it too is why people call him, and I think why we're seeing so much activity out of that studio, and will continue for the next 20 years at a minimum. And when you think about terms like 10 and 20 years, you think about the longer scales of design and planning for obsolescence or planning for the future, and in a sense, future-proofing. And that's so much of what Ralph is doing, what his episode is about. The idea for a car, a sketch or a doodle for the shape of an automobile, by the time that he's drawn that, and by the time that the full life cycle of the car is realized, is sometimes 8, 10, 12, 15 years. And so making design decisions is an incredibly important part of his job, and making sure that they're right and that they're future-proofed is really critical for the function and use cases that the cars that Ralph designs.
I think the best designs are emotional forever. You see an older 300 that's almost 11 years old now, and somehow they still look kind of cool because that emotion was there from the beginning.
I was actually chief of the studio at the time when this program was being developed. The grille became a big part of the car's theme. It really harkened back to Virgil Exner, the 50s cars, aggressive, oversized hoods.
Holding that DNA string is so critical to me.
We kept
making the grill bigger and bigger and bigger until it felt right.
Not always an easy thing to do, to look that far into the future, but the ability to plan at scale and use the modeling techniques that the automotive industry has used as that assessment, and the sort of critique that you can see between Ralph and his team, the back and forth, and why it takes so long to get things right over the course of time. And I think why, when we see some classic cars and that they really speak to us, there's something uncanny about them. There's something about the form. There's something about the shape of that grille that it actually sort of creates culture. And we really saw that with the Chrysler 300 and the subsequent marketing that came out of that with Chrysler. And we saw the M&M Super Bowl ads and the adoption by Beats and Dr. Dre, and that embrace of the black community and of the hip hop community of the design language there, the sort of boldness and expressiveness of Ralph's design in the 300. And then looking for insights outside of the field. Yes, he races cars on the side, but he finds import in fashion, and thinking about sketching and doodling and traveling the world and taking photographs. And that Instagram actually is a great creative outlet for Ralph, and thinking about where he finds his inspiration. And then just getting the bones right, and the fundamentals have to be there. Again, that sort of idea of building the confidence around putting the reps in and doing the 10,000 hours before you can actually go and start tweaking on the details. Paula's really interesting. When we look at her candy wrapper and signs and the Shake Shack logo and the Public Theater, we tend to think that these are immovable and permanent designs. And actually, she has spent so much of her career going in to tweak things. Even the Citibank logo has had very minor and very modest little corrections and changes over the course of the 10 or so years that it's been out. And she's done that extensively with the Public Theater, but it's really about her command and her embrace of typography. Typography as architecture, typography as play. The idea is that you can bring those things together in a medium and in a craft that really hadn't seen the sort of expressivity put into it. And that's really, I think, the heart of her success and what we see in her work.
Typography can create immense power. You're working with things that create character. You're working with weight. You're working with height. If you take an E and the middle bar is the same length as the ends of the E's, it feels different than if the little bar is half the length of the E's. If you lift the little bar up higher, it will make the typeface look like it was drawn in the 1930s. The same thing as if you drop the middle bar lower, it will look modern. If a font is heavy and bold, it may give you a feeling of immediacy. If a font is thin and has a serif form, it may feel classical. So that before you even read it, you have sensibility and spirit. And that if you combine that with a meaning, then that's spectacular.
The thing I love about her work, there's so much life and energy in what she does. And she talks a lot about this, that she needs to be in sort of a state of play, that the risks are low and experimentation is really high. And that idea of play as work, I think, is really what we find and what we see in her designs. And in fact, the best designs don't change brands. They don't reinvent them, they don't reframe them, they just accentuate who they are, and they frame them in the exact right way and make them more of who they already are. And then that idea that time is the context in which we experience design. If you put two chairs together that don't work, it's because one chair doesn't look good next to the other chair. It's the same thing with logos and graphics and identity systems and time. We see things sort of age out, something that looks of an era. It looks 1960s, it looks like the 1980s. And that's just about the context of time changing around them. So much of why she asks her clients to commit to never really stopping, that idea that she's going to go back and continue to tweak and refine and use the context of time and the surroundings to inform the design language, the design process as she moves forward. Platon, I think, was one of the more gratifying and surprising design stories. I've known Platt for a very long time. We did our first photo shoot together in 2001, not that far from here with George H.W. Bush. And I knew that he was trained as a graphic designer. And he used the rules of graphic design, the idea of push and pull, of positive and negative space, combined with sort of architectural frameworks to denote power and influence. And that's really how he became famous. I think we all remember the Bill Clinton Esquire cover that caused such a scandal. But he really became famous by photographing for George Magazine and John Kennedy Jr., photographing figures of power, senators, politicians, world leaders. And it really wasn't until he started to use that into celebrity and then into ordinary and everyday people that he started to understand the frameworks of using push and pull and using positive and negative space to actually create empathy with the viewer and scale shift around the perceptions of a subject themselves. He was literally designing the frame of the photograph in a way that very few photographers actually do or recognize.
I studied graphic design at Art College. My deep respect for form and positive and negative space comes from studying Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of compression and expansion. You walk into a Frank Lloyd Wright building and the entranceway is so small it makes you almost dip your head. And then as soon as you walk into the main room, he blows up the space and it makes you feel, oh, that's so good. These are all lessons I've put into my work. If I can tap into someone's spirit, it's the same feeling as when you walk into a Frank Lloyd Wright room. It opens you up. It does something. And that's either a feeling of complete menace or fear or a feeling of inspiration and hope. But it does do something to you as a person.
I love once you know that about him, that you can look at his images in such a new way. And that's really the core of his work moving forward. He's photographed just about every living world leader, and he gets the assignment from Time Magazine and so on. But is really spending his time now to photograph those outside of power and outside of the normal bounds of society's constructs, especially in government and thinking about those who are disenfranchised globally. So conferring power to people through using the tools that he had established through denoting power and confirming power. For him, it's just about simplicity. You noticed all of those images with the stark white backgrounds. We see images like that in the media quite frequently, but the use of exaggeration and scale and again, the Frank Lloyd Wright ideas of tension and compression really accentuate and heighten the storytelling magic so that almost those people become icons of themselves. It's sort of like the lesson of Paula that you're actually just making someone more of who they are. You're accentuating the things that define them. And that, I think, are some of the best images that he has designed, end up doing that very prolifically. And then again, limitation. Constraint plays a key role in Platt's work. He uses the same camera, the same single light, the same backdrop, the same team, the same lensing, the same script order, the same shoot order, literally every single shoot. And that allows for the flexibility and frameworks to come out where we understand differences in complexity and differences in the subjects themselves. And then finally with Ilse, I didn't know as much about Ilse when we started the series, but I knew I loved her spaces, and I couldn't really put my finger on why. I couldn't figure it out, because there was always something sort of off about her spaces, and they felt very comfortable, and they felt really beautiful, but I didn't quite get how she was doing that until we sat down to talk about it. And that's because she actually puts elements that are discomforting or elementally different than the environment that she's creating. And she talks about that use of a frame for life, design being a frame for life. Well, it's again that idea of the orange bar. You only notice what's right about that cover and the alignments and geometry that I put into that Wired cover because that one little thing is sort of off and it causes you to question. She does the same exact thing, but with a chair or with a lamp or a texture or a piece of brass. And I think the influences of that are really interesting.
The everyday was something that was celebrated and delightful. So one of the core principles was moving away from opulent luxury to a notion that luxury is attention, it's care, it's actually making the ordinary extraordinary.
It's quite simple. It's a single decision inside of a room that brings that care and attention into the mind of the viewer, into the experience of the viewer. This is experience design at its heart. Bringing that care and attention front and center to people and bringing them together. Ultimately, it's about those human connections and how we perceive them and the contrast between that orange chair and the green sofa. I think you'll see that a lot in her work, and bringing and heightening the relationship between objects and between the moments that we create things together. And again, embracing imperfection. Nothing in an Ilsa Crawford room is perfect. Allowing for wear to exist and planning for the future and planning for the obsolescence of the objects inside of the environments that she operates within. This is a lot, and I've thrown it all at you, and I will share all of this with everybody here. But I just wanted to sort of peel the curtain back a little bit from the series. It's so gratifying to hear that you guys have enjoyed watching the series and that you've been able to share some ideas and thoughts around it. I'm really grateful for this conversation to continue. So you've been very, very patient and kind to have me up here, and I'm happy to talk at length about any questions or thoughts or ideas that you guys have. So thank you so much. I think we have some microphones.
Yeah, so if
populating the
everybody
floor
could
here.
come up to the microphones if you have any questions, and you can fire away. Let's see. We usually have tons of questions, so I know that you've got
I
them.
answered every question before. No, surely you guys have.
I see Ben coming up. I see a few people.
There we go.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Julie. I have a question about your production process. Did you have a month with every person? Did you film it all in like a week? I'm just curious. And then did you film them in order in which they appeared in the series? I'm just kind of curious about your timeline.
A great question. These folks are all super busy, and we wanted to design the show around their work. And we wanted to design a process that would enable them to really participate in it and yet not take them away from the things that they need to earn their living and the obligations that they have to their craft. So what we did was actually, there's a really vast scale of difference. What we did was budget for 5 to 7 shooting days per episode, and then sit and just work with the subjects to understand where opportunities might exist. In Christoph's case, it was very condensed because he got a phone call from the New Yorker and said, I need you to do this cover. Can you do it? And he literally is like, it's go time right now. And so we all flew to Berlin and we spent 5 days with him. So most of that episode that happens in one day is across a Monday through a Friday, literally the 40-hour work week that we spent with him. He just wore the same sweater and pants every day. And then we went back to New York the very following weekend and shot 2 more days in New York, where he also has a studio. So that was the most compressed, and that was actually the first one that we shot and the first one that we finished. And it ended up being the first one in the series. I think we sort of fell in love with it. It was, I think, in our minds, the most perfect distillation of what abstract was intended to be as filmmakers. The longest process was Bjarke's, and that was because of the scale of the architecture. And he mentions in the episode, you know, a fast building gets built in 6 years. And he actually got the commission for the Serpentine Gallery, and it was a similar scenario where he called us and said, it's go time. I actually have a 6-month project that we can see beginning, middle, and end. And in fact, that ended up being a 12-month process. So we filmed with him about a day a month over the course of 11 or 12 months, both in New York and in Copenhagen and in London. And sometimes it was like we had him for an hour in London. So we had the whole trip and the whole crew go there and just to capture one meeting or him wandering around the Serpentine lawn. And then everything else sort of fell in between those two boundaries, and we would just work very carefully to design the best outcomes because of the lensing and camera gear and the size of the crew to make something that feels as polished as I hope it does. Let's alternate over here. Yes?
Oh, goody. I was wondering, we keep seeing season 1 of Abstract, so hopefully there'll be a season 2. But is there an artist or a designer that you really would have liked to be able to do an episode on that you didn't get a chance to?
There are a bunch of artists that
If you could pick one.
I really, I'm going to get into trouble if I say that. I have so much travel coming up. So that's what I can say. I've got a lot of travel coming up. So yes, and have been traveling for a little while, actually. So I'll answer with a non-answer. Where else? How about right here, straight ahead?
Go ahead, yeah. I have a question specifically about the big episode. So I noticed that one, more so than the others, you incorporated a lot of his negative feedback, and I know within the architecture community, he is received with a lot of mixed reviews. Was that intentional to incorporate that more than any of the other designers and artists?
It was intentional that we incorporate feedback because we didn't want to create hagiography. We didn't want just to be the booster club of all of these artists, although we really wanted to celebrate them and celebrate the design accomplishments that they've achieved. It was important for us to look at the broader context of how their designs affect people. And in certain ways, buildings, one set of decisions by a builder and an architect can inform an entire community for decades. So there's big impact that comes out of that. I think Bjarke's was more pronounced because of how accelerated he has taken his career, how much thought and promotion he has put into the build out of his practice of Big. And it sort of rose to the top more quickly in our reporting process and our filmmaking process than the others. The key for us was to sort of provide a voice of inoculation that, yeah, they are amazing and they do all these amazing things, but there's also this thing here where there's a concern or a question or a personal doubt. And I think we saw the personal doubt creep in with Tinker especially, where he really had some struggles with a significant period of his design career with MJ.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Who's next?
Yeah, I had a question about wrong theory specifically. So I feel like a lot of the work that we do at HomeAway, and specifically the work my team does, is we're always trying to iterate on what works and iterating on things that we have a lot of data to back up. So I wonder if you could speak to balancing breaking those rules while still relying on data and knowing that what you're going to do has something to back it up.
I think that idea of function becomes really important. And looking at examples like the iMac in particular, where is, and I think wrong theory in particular tends to start in aesthetics. I think the Instagram version and story is a bit of an exception where it was actually the creation of the platform and creation of the tool that was taken on in an inverse, where the particulars of right and wrong, what people do and do not do based on convention and exception. I tend to see it in the aesthetic values first, but it's not, and I tend not to define it in kinds of ways. Do you guys remember Ray Gun magazine, David Carson? It was that sort of grunge design where it was aggressively unreadable. It was sort of in the Wired era where it was much more about being antithetical to a journalistic experience. It was much more of the substrate and the sort of emotional experience of music itself. And that was one where I don't think I would classify it as wrong theory. And I've had that conversation a bunch about, is punk wrong theory? And I think there are degrees of perception and value that I think reasonable people would disagree about what is and what isn't. But for me, it's about it must work and it must work well. It's about the challenging of the perception or accentuating what part of working well needs to evolve in order to find some progress. I don't think any of us would agree that our smartphones are a miraculous device, but they're kind of boring now. And when boring sort of emerges as a platform, that's when interesting things starts to happen because people start looking for new ways to try things. And the Pixel 2 is really an interesting case. The little orange button, a small thing in the grand scheme of it, but I think that was one of the first times where I saw a contrasting interface development in a piece of hardware like that. Who knows where that goes? I can't say, but I feel like we're at that sort of phase where the experimentation is starting to begin, and we're going to start to see some failures, and then ultimately something that moves it forward. How about right here?
So you've made a very beautiful show about people making beautiful things, and so I'm curious how you decided to balance showing off their art with displaying yours.
In terms of the things that I've made?
No, I mean the style of the show, the beauty and the aesthetic of it is very much a part of the story, it seems like.
So I have two filmmaking partners in abstract. Morgan Neville, who won the Academy Award for 20 Feet from Stardom, and he just released the Mr. Rogers film, which I don't know if you guys have seen. It's so good. And he is, I think, one of the best storytellers and directors working in documentary film today. And then Dave O'Connor, who's on the sort of operations side of it. And my contribution was very much about the designers, the value of their designs, the storytelling elements, married with Morgan's filmmaking elements, and Dave on the production side of things. How do we get crews around and move them into spaces where we can tell these stories effectively and on budget? So that's sort of the overall framework of it. Abstract was heavily influenced by my personal aesthetics as a designer, and why I sort of show the work that I've done and the work that I've collaborated with my friends and colleagues, because it's sort of the way that I look at the world. We have a tool inside of Abstract that we've nicknamed the design hallucination. It's like that moment when Bjarke has the two buildings and they sort of go on to, he's describing that. That's sort of hard to go film that. So we decided, what's the most elemental, almost like a Saul Bass-like moment where you could just use shape and form and color to describe a really complex concept. And that was something we tried to build in. You see it in the Platon episode with his anecdote about dyslexia and his trouble about simplifying shapes and words and images down into their most elemental. So I'm the kind of designer that likes that because of my quest for cleanliness and order and rigor around color and form and typography. So I think that's sort of the balance and the role that I tried to play in the show. Sir?
Okay, first of all, I thought it was a great show, all the shows. My favorite was Bjarke. He's very unique in his way in that, his yes is more versus less is more. It's contrasting in a way with, I guess, with Christoph Niemann. And he likes to remove things and simplify. Or with, many of the others actually take more of a management approach or iteration approach. He's sort of expansive in that way. I guess my question to you is, do you see a trend going that new kind of irreverent, sort of aggressive, bold way of yes is more and combination and you can have it all? Is that a trend you see in the future in more than just architecture?
I don't know that I could point to it and say that it is. I think in digital means, especially if you look at something like the App Store or the way we use apps, it's very much been a narrowing and a focusing. Apps that had a bunch of tabs and different functions and utilities built into them, I think are sort of falling by the way of a single use, a single application, for lack of a better word, and how they effectively coexist on our phone, and the idea that context is everything. You're going to have other tools and other things to interface with it. Versus something like Bjarke, where I think we are seeing the quest for bigger, more expansive, first of kind, and marrying that with the needs of sustainability and use of materials and the ecological damages or benefits provided to the communities where these buildings exist. So I think it depends a bit more on form and function and the continuing evolution of how we consume media itself.
Cool. Thanks.
Who else? There we go.
Yeah, so you talk a lot about discomfort and how that's a part of the process. That seems relatively straightforward when you're talking with one or two people, a creative director to an EIC, the head of a company or corporation with the person they're working with. Have you seen that work on a kind of a larger scale at larger companies where someone kind of maybe in the middle to lower levels has this idea of discomfort and now needs to push that discomfort up the chain of command? And if you have, like, what are the ways to effectively make that happen so that you don't kind of have one person pushing something forward and then it kind of gets stopped at some point? Or do you see that as a problem at all?
The examples that I tend to see or have researched about wrong theory, so again, my rules, feel free to throw them out and they are wrong, but they tend to center on people who have enough achievement in their career that they can push around a system. That Paula Scher doesn't sign up to work on your graphics package for just anybody. You basically have to sign up for the fact that she's gonna bully you a little bit, or she's gonna have her decision met with some sort of authority. And so you see that in Miles Davis at the peak of his powers after two significant evolutions with modal jazz and Birth of the Cool. He had been at a level with most famous jazz musician on the planet when he came out with Bitches Brew. And so that idea of achievement and process, getting to a certain level in one's career is really important. Another example that I like is David Chase in The Sopranos. It took him 7 years, 8 years of making that show, 63 perfect episodes by all measures of television, inventing the sort of genre of new long-form, long-arc storytelling, and then to cut the last episode off with the strict to black. It made people crazy. And I've talked to him and the execs and the fights that he had to have in order to do that. And you were not supposed to do that. You remember like 6 Feet Under, or any of the other shows that would end around that era, you would tie it all up in a bow, kind of like what happened with Seinfeld and them ending up in jail. You're not supposed to do that. And so you see examples where people become masters of their craft and auteurs in some sense before they're able to pull off the really big and noticeable moments of wrong theory.
Cool.
But not to say you can't use it as a tool in the sort of day-to-day function.
Cool, thanks.
I have a question about your career.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the beginning that you're at the bagel shop and you raised your hand and you did the lettering. Looking back on your career, are there moments similar to that? Like, yes, I'll do it, like where you stepped up and it kind of led you to a different level?
I think I've been lucky enough to do that a couple of times. The Wired iPad app was one of those examples where we went to Apple in mid-2009, actually in August of 2009, and I had been working on this idea. iPhone was 2 years old at this point. There was no public press about an iPad, and certainly the name iSlate and all the names were long in the distance before they were being debated. And a couple of my colleagues and I went down to Apple, and I said, if you are ever going to build a largest multi-touch slate thing, we think content ought to look like this on it. And we think the web has had some failures in terms of design fidelity and storytelling acumen, and we think there's a better way to arrange words and pictures into really compelling stories. And the room of people there at Apple, all dear friends now over the years, there's a lot of, interesting. And I remember that very specifically. That was one of those moments where we were sort of raising our hand ahead of that. And that was the case in going back to Wired after having done that for a couple of years at Condé Nast and been able to work with some incredible editors. I actually got to sit in their newsrooms and work alongside them and understand how they viewed and processed journalism in their shop. And it taught me so much. It was sort of like getting my doctorate in magazines, because I got to sit and learn from David Remnick and Anna Wintour and Graydon Carter, such that I raised my hand and say, when the time comes, I'd like to go back to Wired and I'd like to try some new things out there. So it's something that has served me well, and I probably get a little bit overly ambitious from time to time, but it was a big part of why I wanted to start the firm with Patrick, that we could go out and sort of chase opportunities as we saw them.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, my name is Tina.
Hi, Tina.
Hi. First off, I would like to just basically let you know that I really enjoyed your project here. And like, as soon as I was done with each episode, I felt like I gotta write or sing or do something. Like, I gotta express myself. Felt like a little volcano. Excuse me, I've had 3 Red Bulls, so I'm kind of. Thank you. But my question is, thank you. My question is, when it comes to creativity and ideas and things of that nature, what advice would you give to someone who is looking to, either, whether it be create an app or create another feature to make, the traveler experience better? When it comes to uniqueness, we're so inundated with everyone's idea. Everybody is trying to make, user experience more functional and easier and more fluid. So I guess I'll speak I statements. So it's kind of hard sometimes to kind of not feel, not defeated, but like, well, my idea is just like everybody else's idea, and I'm not unique. Whatever I think of, someone else has already thought of it, or they're already leveling up on it. How do you navigate those waters as a creative person or as a designer or artist?
I think it's a great question. I have struggled with that myself. I think the shortest answer, and something that I've tried to do both personally and with my teams, is find a buddy who's not like you. and who challenges you personally. And I think of my best creative collaborators, my most favorite creative collaborators, and they tend to do things very differently than I do. And I sort of glue myself to them because it makes me uncomfortable. I've come to recognize that's probably a good thing for me, that I'm going to learn something. And B, I think the work tends to be better. And it was something that I tried to do in building my art department when I was creative director and my editorial team as editor-in-chief, of finding pairings of super seasoned people and super junior people, people who like the rough edges and people who like the clean edges, people who like a lot of color, people who don't like color at all. And I'd force them to work together. And I think interesting things can happen. It's not by any stretch a solve or a prescription to finding better work or better happiness through that work. But I've seen personal results out of it, and I've enjoyed it. And I think some interesting collaborations tend to happen in that place. So find a buddy.
I will do so. Thank you.
Hi.
My question is related to hers, but probably a little different. It's about, you mentioned, with mobile phones and fonts, there's sort of consensus coming up as to what a good design is, and you would see that coming up in various other fields as well. With such conformity, what do you think would be the approach to differentiate as a company or as a brand? Because design seems to, converge towards one particular solution.
Yeah. There's a lot of consensus on the web now. I think you see a lot of pages, a lot of sites, a lot of frameworks where you cover up the brand name and you wouldn't know. And that's interesting because we probably found some consensus around function. We know what works, right? And there is a school of thought that emerges around IA and UX for moving people efficiently and seamlessly through digital products. So that's a good thing. On the other side, and maybe a good example would be Amazon.com. That's not a pretty website, but boy, it'll move some paper towels through into your shopping cart. They do a great job, right? That's a great design. It works really, really well. And I think when we are faced with this question, when we consider it, and we're trying to solve a problem or work on a strategy, I tend to see it as something around the function. And going back to the Porsche quote, it's about the elegance of its function. And maybe it's okay that all the phones look the same, and maybe it's okay that all the typefaces are the same, but how do they work, and do they enable you to do something in a way that drives your business forward or connects people in new ways or finds a solution that you maybe hadn't thought of before? Right here.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Yuneli. So in talking with a lot of my colleagues leading up to today and then also today, one of the biggest things that I took away was that a lot of us had actually already seen the show on our own and really took opportunity to rewatch it with a more critical eye with this incentive of coming to be here today. So it was really cool. I had already seen about 3 of the episodes on my own. And many of the other themes throughout the episode I've kind of pulled from different experiences, whether it's like the idea that design can be, architecture and interior design can be functional and beautiful, or the idea of font really being able to amplify user experience. But one of the biggest takeaways that I had from this was the idea that design can inform the future and that you can design towards the future, mainly because it's not something that I think about day to day in my work or forget to at times because you get inundated with the day-to-day work or pushing out this Instagram post or sending out this email. How have you reconciled that, or how have you seen other people reconcile that, given a lot of the more fleeting mediums that we use now, whether as like a magazine editor where you have like a monthly product that you're pushing out, or as we're pushing out, right? It's forgotten once you have the new one. How do you reconcile designing for the future and being able to do that when we do have such fleeting platforms today? Seemingly fleeting.
I think it's a great question. I think a challenge that all designers today wrestle with. And I think it comes down to the idea of designers being optimists. And I've encountered, and I've been really fortunate to work with optimists through so many of these different jobs and roles that I just described. But at its heart, I think that design solves problems. If you think about why we engage in design, why do we work together, why do we find cooperation among a set of teams or a team, and it ends up because you're working together to solve a problem. And it's like the great Noam Chomsky quote, if you don't work against the solution, you're unlikely to solve it. it's because you're actually participating in the change that you're trying to create, and you're trying to work to create a better version of tomorrow. That was what was so inspiring about working with President Obama, and why I think the foundation is so compelling. Everyone's like, where's Obama and what is he doing, and what he needs to step up and help us out right now. He's looking at the longest arc possible. He's looking at 20 years, 30 years, and thinking about training people. Red and blue, white and black, it doesn't matter. It's just about engaging and solving problems together. So in some ways, he's trying to design a better democracy. And I find that hugely inspiring, and something that I tend to look up to almost every day.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hi, Scott.
Hi.
First of all, I'm a huge fan, and I think your interview with Hundinki Radio was really great. I listened
thank
to
you,
it
thank
yesterday.
you.
My question is actually along the lines of President Obama. What specific lessons did you learn from him about design that you were surprised about?
I would point to the previous answer, just in about working together to create a better future, and that it comes at its heart from his roots in community organizing in the South Side of Chicago. That if you guys agree with my notion that design is decision making, every decision that every one of us makes together throughout a day is accretive. We build on that, and we help each other out, and through that work we can make a better community make a better democracy. And so I think that was front and center for me, in the careful analysis, the thoughtfulness, the research that he put into our work together. I've seldom, if ever, had a collaborator as emotionally intelligent and kind, and thinking about how he treats the people around him, including total strangers like me, into the research phase, the work phase, along with all the duties that obviously he was performing as president, and to merge both of those, and to be as present as he was in the moments that we got to spend together, and as responsible a leader as he was. I think you can probably tell I'm a big fan. And that balance is something that I try to achieve, and love working with people who are able to influence me in that kind of way as well.
Thank you. I'm a big fan too, so.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Sir?
Yeah, reflecting on your talk, what really struck me is this realization that many of the best decisions in my life have been decisions when it felt like I was ruining my life. And in fact, accepting a job at Home Away was one of those. Turns out to have been a great decision. So I was wondering if you might tell us a story about a time in your own life when you thought you were actually ruining your life.
Oh, man. Let me go down the list. I loved living in Austin. I loved it. And friends and family still here, who I got to see yesterday. And I thought it was, I knew I wanted to take on the challenge of Wired. I had looked up to Wired religiously since I first encountered it in college. And yet, that was one of those moments I felt as you did. I'm totally ruining my life and uprooting myself out of this community of friends in a place that I love, to go someplace I had never been before in the form of San Francisco. And that all the way through career moves and thinking about taking risks on work and taking risks on design, the little things that will maybe give you an evening of heartburn versus something that gives you months. And it probably took me a year to think about that in terms of leaving Wired, but it was the accretion of all the things that I was able to do there, and it felt like I had the responsibility to allow someone else to do that. And I felt like my attentions were turned into abstract, into thinking about solving problems and design problems in new ways. But that wasn't easy. That felt really difficult, to leave one of the best jobs in the world and go out on my own. So it's something I'm sure I will deal with plenty more times in the course of my career. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Val, and I really admired the storytelling aspect of the entire series and how each story was so rich. One story in particular that stood out to me was in Paula's episode, where you kind of zoomed in on the fact that she was female and how she was actually received as being female. What took the story in that direction? Was it just a natural evolution, or was that something that you knew you were going to actually tackle these tough subjects in the series, like in with Platon and the dyslexia and things of that nature? What took things in that direction?
It was calculated.
Okay.
We, in our casting process, we have a pretty rigorous interview process where some combination of the three of us, me, Dave, and Morgan, would sit down with these designers and just talk and go to a lunch, a meal, a coffee, a drink, and just talk as creators, creator to creator, and obviously we know and understand the importance of their work, but get to know them as people and how their charisma operates and the adversities that they faced. And in particular, Paula brought that up very early on in our conversations, the struggles and mountains she's had to climb in being a woman in this field dominated traditionally by men, and being the first female partner in Pentagram, in the history of Pentagram, and the role that she plays there in recruiting other women partners into the practice there, and the leadership she endeavors to provide through teaching and lectures and participating in shows like Abstract. So it was really calculated. With Platts, I've just known him forever, and I knew that he had struggled with that, and so it was a process of getting comfortable with him revealing that and being upfront about the sort of why of it and how it influenced his creative work.
Well, it meant a lot, so thank you for doing
Cool.
that.
Thank you. I'll pass it on. Hi.
Hi, I'm Ray.
I'm sorry if you guys have been waiting. I'm just...
Okay. I'm just curious, do you believe that a good design is always within the boundary of a certain cultural background, or just one design can be popular all over the world?
I think it can. I think good design can transcend culture. Yeah. I think it has to be born of a context, and I think the best designs speak to their audience and speak to the context most effectively. But you are going to put me on the spot here to make me think of one in particular. Do you have an idea?
Well, it's a question for me as well, because I observed that lots of luxury brands actually publish some new products every year with some Chinese element on that. But as a Chinese, most of the time we feel like it looks ugly. So I'm just curious, does a good design always apply to only certain culture background?
I don't think you could use the word only. I think Instagram's a good example. Yeah. That's a billion people around the world who think that's a good design and who use it every month. I'd say Facebook's probably in that same category. It was an effective platform in a certain context, but its adoption across a range of different devices and inputs and cultural norms and uses is probably highly specified based on its perfect geography. But I think Instagram's a really good, it's very simple design that tends to work well globally.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi. So I really love the idea of wrong theory and making and breaking the grid. Sometimes I feel like when I'm uncomfortable about doing a design decision, it actually does end up being wrong. So how do you differentiate?
Me too.
How do you differentiate between good wrong and bad wrong?
It's a great question. One I struggle with myself. I think the buddy factor is really good here. The way that the magazines that I've always worked at, from Texas Monthly all the way through the course of my career, it's always a mentor-mentee relationship between a writer and an editor, or a designer and an art director and a creative director, and the dialogue between those two people. All the work that I've shown of mine and my collaborators and of Abstract, those are all teams of people in dialogue and debate all the time. Paula is a practitioner and the leader of her practice, but she's got a dozen people that work with her because she trusts them and because they challenge each other. Ralph has 300 people, and you can see that debate on almost every scene that he's working on that electric car. So I think you have to put your trust in your personal feelings, but you also have to be open to criticism, constructive and otherwise, in the dialogue around research and saying, well, that's already been done before, but this is new, and how do you feel about that? And that ends up being a really critical component. It has been for me, and learning to trust in the opinion of others.
Thanks.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi.
I really like the idea about how the design process should be, and here at HomeAway, we follow experimentation and test and learn in a lot of product features that we release. I would like to hear your thoughts about how do you find the right balance between an intuitive design and a totally radical design that requires explanation or manual.
I think constraint ends up being really important there. If you can establish, my process, I can't speak to yours, but it starts with sort of a diligence and research phase where we have to understand what goes on in the world, where do we find ourselves as people and use of a product or a thing, into a strategy, into a design phase where we're actually making decisions around the thing, and then into the sort of constructive criticism where data is coming back in and we're revising and looking back at more diligence. So for us and for me, I really value that constraint to say, these steps are really necessary for me to do good work. I can try and I can drop in later and I could or get out earlier and not worry about the reception. And it doesn't have to be quantitative data. It can be emotional. It can be the sort of personal feedback. It can be you guys saying you like the show. That's great data, and so let's go make some more. That idea is really important to me. So I think it's harder for me as a designer to say this is right and that's wrong in terms of process.
Thanks.
Hello. Hi, Scott. Thank you, first of all, to give us 8 beautiful series, which has given us eye to appreciate design. These are 8 successful stories for these designers. My question was is it a good idea to explore some of their failures and how they deal with it, and exploring that part of design, because we don't know how to deal with a failure in a design.
I think the failures end up being some of the most instructive parts of design, and I'd mentioned before, I think, but the Tinker's view of a couple of the Air Jordans in that moment where he felt really tired and run down, he wasn't making effective decisions, ended up being really critical, and him wanting to step away and find some rest and find time with his family, and knowing that the arc of his career was going to far transcend making a few mistakes or meeting with a poor critical review or critical reception or poor sales goals. The mistakes end up being some of the most instructive, I think, and if they're painful, then probably the more instructive they end up being.
Right. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
Hi.
Hi. Where? Oh, hi. Sorry. Lights.
Hi. You mentioned that Amazon may not be the best website. What are some of your favorite websites or apps, and why in terms of design?
That's a great question. I think The Cut. Do you guys read The Cut? New York Mag, the fashion and culture site? I think it's beautiful. I love what they have done, and Stella Bugbee, the creative lead there, she and her team have just put together, I think, what a contemporary version of a digital magazine experience. So I think it's some of the best design that I've seen executed inside of a browser. That's a site that I look at all the time. I also think New York Magazine is beautiful for what it has to do and for the advertising needs that it has to serve. That homepage, the density of it, the sort of frenetic sort of shouting, lots of stories coming at you very quickly. I'm sort of a news junkie, so I tend to look at those a lot. Mr. Porter, in terms of shopping, I think is really neat. A guy named Dan Rookwood did a lot of good work there. He just moved over to Nike, but Dan was the editor-in-chief, and to sort of merge the ideas of a lifestyle publication with a commerce opportunity, I think was very effectively managed by Dan and his team.
Thank you.
Maybe time for one more? There we go.
Hello. As you stated in the keynote at some point, design is how to make things work. And I found that the 8 episodes were really interesting because they were putting a lot of emphasis for me on things like empathy, creativity that are not really natural for me, let's say. But I was also expecting somehow in the show to see maybe a bit more of the back end, what I was imagining as a back and forth with the engineering teams, because I guess that when you design a car or when you design the shoes, there are lots of engineering stuff that the designer has to deal with. And I felt like we are seeing a small amount of them, but it was not really treated in depth. And I was wondering if it was a choice from you to show more the creativity part of the design, the artistic way, or if it was, well, I don't know if.
No, it's a great question, and it was a choice. It was a bit pragmatic in that we had a deadline to deliver the show, and the one thing, like in the car episode, there was a lot of back and forth that we weren't allowed to see in terms of engineering because the proprietary secrets of that engineering group really are the special sauce, way more than even how the car is going to look or function. So value engineering, where does the battery go, and the structural needs, and all of that was there, but it was also going to take almost 3 years to complete that work. And so selfishly, we wanted to get the story out. And I think if we're lucky enough to get to do a little bit more, then we'll be showing a little bit more of that relationship, because I think the design decision-making process really extends into things that we don't see. And it's really an important area of design, especially in digital and product, that we need to explore more thoroughly, especially as more of our lives turn over to that set of mediums.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool.
So Scott, I wanted to share one thing that you're more recently celebrating that I don't think you shared, which speaks very much to your humility, but the series abstract was recently nominated for an Emmy. So pretty amazing.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
So let's make it big. I feel like I should do something wrong. Like I was like, maybe I should take off my shoes when I walk up here, and just like it feels really uncomfortable. So let's do a very home away warm round of applause, and please stand and join me in thanking Scott for being here.
Guys. Thank you. Thank y'all. Thank you. Thanks. Very cool. Thank you. Very cool.
So the cool thing is Scott's going to stick around for a little bit, and so he may be stopping by your tables to see how things are going and check in, because what we're doing the second half of the day is working to apply some of what we've just learned from Scott. So we are going to put wrong theory to the test today, and he mentioned a few things I wanted to call out in his presentation. So one, some of you were at other product academies. Raise your hands again. Okay. It's a lot. So you have seen our branding, right? And did you notice that today we changed it up and we put a twist on the owl, we added some color, and I'm not sure that we did wrong theory just right for it, but what we did want to do is we wanted to change things up for you all for this one to really pull in the theme. So we're going to do that in your groups, and I'm not going to give away. Colin and Rebecca are going to share what we'll be doing and how we'll do that, but a few things that I wanted to call out from Scott's presentation. One is that we've set up, so this first half of the day, we really tried to set up the design thinking framework. So what is a standard, a very good design thinking framework? You may not feel like you're experts, so we may not have gotten it perfect yet, but as Scott talked about, you want to do it well. You want to get to a place where your design is really good. So hopefully we've given you an exercise in getting it to a good place. And now we are going to, what's the wording he used that was so good? So we constructed our frame, and now we want to break it. So we are going to break it in a few ways and help you try to get outside of the usual design thinking you've been doing and break it a little bit. So we're going to have some fun with that, but we're going to take a quick 15-minute break. Give you some time to break, say hello to Scott if you'd like, and then come back and we will get started.